Right, I think people are still coming in, but we'll, more are popping in. I'll make a go at starting. I'm Anthony Brown, I'm chair of the all-party parliamentary group on the environment. Thank you very much for attending this session on carbon capture and storage, specifically looking at the business model and how it might actually be made from a policy point of view. As I'm sure everyone knows, carbon capture and storage is the idea of actually taking carbon dioxide out of either the emissions of factories or steel plant or an energy plant, or indeed direct air capture out of the air and storing it permanently in presumably underground or under the sea. It's quite new technologies, although there is a commercial plant we'll hear about just about to start. The government has a slightly patchy record on its backing for this. It's in the past, over the last sort of 15 years or so, it supported it and then cut support and then supported it again. It is now firmly sort of mainstream policy. It's part of the 10-point plan that the Prime Minister introduced to build back better, but in particular to reach net zero by 2050. It's very much part of that, and the government's committed, I think it's £800 million from memory towards it, and it's very keen to make a success of it. The UK is seen as a key opportunity for the UK because of our oil and gas industry and the geological formations in the North Sea that could be ideal for storing carbon in perpetuity. But one of the key questions is actually, how do we make this work? Would it require permanent subsidies from the government, taxpayer subsidies, or is there a proper way that we can make carbon markets work for it, where other companies have incentives to pay carbon capture and storage companies to take carbon dioxide out and store it? Because that, in my view, and I think the government's view, that is the only way it would be sustainable in the long run, rather than permanent public sector subsidies. Although, as we know, with the wind power, we might need subsidies to start things off and get things going, get things scalable. So with that, I'll just turn to our speakers. We've got Jason Shipstone, who's the Chief Innovation Officer at Drax, the power company which used to be famous for its coal, but is now reinventing itself as a biofuels and carbon capture and storage company. There's David Cairns, who I should declare happens to be a constituent of mine, but he's the Vice President of Political and Public Affairs of Equinor, which used to be called Statoil, the Norwegian oil company. So that's actually very actively involved in carbon capture and storage in Norway. And David, I know, used to be the UK's ambassador to Sweden. We've got Luke Warren, who's the Chief Executive of the Carbon Capture and Storage Association. So that's the industry body that's representing the carbon capture and storage sector, which is quite a wide range of different players. And then we've got Dr. Maxine Atkerst, who's from the British Geological Survey, who's been studying carbon capture and storage, I think, for well over a decade now. So with that, they're all going to make little presentations for about 5 minutes each, and I've urged them to stick to time. And then we open up, as always, to questions and answers. And if you do want to ask a question, then you can put your hand up, or a little yellow hand, but I might not see it. Do put a question in the chat that you want to ask a question, or indeed, if you just want me to read out a question, you can type the question. So without further ado, I'm going to get to our first speaker, who's Jason Shipstone from Drax. Jason, over to you.
Thank you. So just by way of introduction, at Drax, we're committed to enabling a zero carbon, lower cost energy future. That's our purpose. This means investing in technologies needed for net zero, such as bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, which is the BECCS acronym, where that comes from, and moving away from fossil fuels such as coal and gas, which we've already done. So our journey away from coal and gas pretty much complete following the end of coal operations at the power station in March 2021. This transformation has already reduced our CO2 emissions by 85%, making Drax the largest decarbonisation project in Europe. We're ready to make an even greater contribution to the UK's net zero plans as we work towards our ambition to be a carbon negative company by 2030. So BECCS is the key enabling technology that will allow us to achieve this, and my job as Chief Innovation Officer at Drax is to lead the team delivering it. I know many of you will have heard our CEO, Will Gardner, set out how BECCS works at previous environmental APPG events, but I just wanted to provide a brief overview before I turn to business models. So as an overview of BECCS, at Drax, we've converted from coal to use biomass from sustainably managed forests that absorb CO2 from the atmosphere as they grow. And this is what makes biomass carbon neutral. So by adding a technology like CCS onto the back of a carbon neutral technology, allows us to deliver negative emissions as more CO2 is stored both in the forest as it regrows and also in geological storage. Even accounting for our supply chain emissions, we can still be significantly carbon negative. So we've proven that this works at the power station. We've had a couple of pilot plants running now for over a year. And I think we're the first power company in the world to capture CO2 from 100% biomass. So we've started that process and we're well on with the development now. We finished our pre-feed study and we will start our feed study later this year. I won't talk about how BECCS works because this is really about business models and not about technology. But the scale-up piece now is our big challenge. And in doing that, we're working closely with colleagues like Equinor and others in the region to set up the necessary transport and storage infrastructure needed, and also with our colleagues in the Northern Endurance Partnership offshore for the sequestration, which is a key part of supporting the BECCS technology that we hope to deploy in Drax. So I guess the key challenges around business models. So BECCS is a game-changing negative emission technology that permanently removes CO2 from the atmosphere and will be needed globally to meet climate targets. It complements other renewables like wind and solar. You can't operate an energy system on pure renewables alone. You need something that's firm, base load, dispatchable to complement intermittent renewables. And BECCS provides that. So you get two products, you get power and negative emissions. However, there currently isn't a business model in place which works for a technology like BECCS that are able to do both of these things. So we need confidence to invest. We need government to come forward with new innovative business models, models which will guarantee a rate of return in the medium term and enable our board to get comfortable to go ahead with a significant upfront investment that we'd have to make in technology like this. But I think it's important to differentiate between the subsidy regimes that have been used before. That's not what's being called for here. And if you look at the direction of travel of carbon price, then technologies like BECCS will ultimately pay for themselves in the longer term as carbon prices rise above the cost of capturing CO2, permanently removing it from the atmosphere and storing it underground. So practical next steps for us. In the case of BECCS, we're making good progress. The energy white paper published by the government at the end of last year also describes biomass as one of our most valuable tools for reaching net zero emissions, which obviously we agree with. This recognises that as well as negative emissions, BECCS also delivers dispatchable, flexible, renewable power, which helps support the expansion of offshore wind and other technologies. The publication of the Energy White Paper and the Prime Minister's 10-point plan provided confidence in the government's support for carbon capture technology, and we're working closely with ministers and officials at BEIS to turn the government's vision into reality. The two ongoing reviews on greenhouse gas removals by BEIS and the National Infrastructure Commission are important next steps in developing business models for us. Having these in place by 2022 will allow us to take our final investment decision on the first BECCS unit in early 2024. So with the right regulatory framework, Drax aims to have the first BECCS facility operational by 2027. So opportunities around that. Bioenergy with carbon capture and storage is the most scalable negative emission technology available today to remove CO2 from the atmosphere. A recent report by the International Energy Agency on CCUS said that BECCS is the most mature of all carbon capture technologies, which obviously we agree with. BECCS is also quite a lot cheaper than other negative emission technologies or nets. So the CCC estimates average cost for BECCS in power generation at around £158 a tonne of CO2. We believe from the work that we've done that we can deliver BECCS at Drax for under £100 a tonne, plus the price of wholesale power. So BECCS can also be a vital enabling component of other low carbon energy alternatives such as hydrogen. So BECCS, BE's bioenergy, not just bioelectricity, so that energy could be hydrogen. According to experts, 85% of power will come from renewables like wind and solar by 2050. And I've mentioned before that the other 15% will need to come from reliable, dispatchable, sustainable sources of power like biomass. It's also an opportunity for the green post-COVID recovery. So new energy technologies such as BECCS at Drax will contribute to creating around 50,000 new jobs in the north of England, while supporting and preventing many existing ones in industries which would otherwise not survive in a net zero future. Furthermore, recent independent analysis by leading energy consultancy Baringa, commissioned by us, evaluating the impact of deploying BECCS at scale as part of achieving the country's climate change targets, found that without BECCS, meeting the 28 to 2032 carbon budgets, which is the fifth carbon budget, would cost approximately 4.5 billion more than if we did that without BECCS. We plan to capture up to 8 million tonnes of CO2 a year by developing 2 BECCS units at Drax by 2030, and that would deliver roughly 40% of the negative emissions from BECCS that the UK Climate Change Committee indicates will be needed in 2050 for the UK to reach net zero. So the challenges are quite simple. We're calling on government to develop new bespoke business models and to do so at a pace and at a time when it's developing extensive policy across the climate change agenda. The Prime Minister has set big ambitions, and I'm confident the government will rise to the challenge and enable companies like Drax to help deliver this vision. And the recent cluster competition, which was launched on Friday, was a very welcome step by us in that direction. Very helpful. So just a couple of closing remarks. To finish, bioenergy with carbon capture and storage is a game-changing negative emissions technology that permanently removes CO2 from the atmosphere and will be needed globally to meet climate change targets. None of the CCS technologies discussed today will individually enable us to meet the UK's net zero target. We'll need them all. So there is no silver bullet. We need multiple solutions and technologies. BECCS complements these other technologies and can provide the firm power and negative emissions the country needs. We stand ready to invest in BECCS at Drax. So my closing message really is one around, let's get on with it. Now is the moment to act if we want to capture the opportunity, lock away carbon in the ground where it belongs, lead the global fight against climate change and turbocharge the clean growth and jobs in the Humber and in the UK.
Okay, Jason, thank you very much. A bit more than 5 minutes. But coming next to David Cairns from Equinor, the Norwegian state oil company.
Yes, good afternoon. Nice to see everybody. Just to say by start, this is supposed to be interesting and useful to you all. If there are any questions that I didn't answer to your satisfaction, please do let me know afterwards and I'll follow up. And of course, you're always very welcome to come and visit our facilities in the UK or even when we're allowed over in Norway. So Equinor, as Anthony has said, is Norway's biggest company. We are a major energy producer and we are a major now investor in the UK. So we are building Dogger Bank with SSE, the world's largest wind farm. And as Jason has mentioned, we are very heavily investing in the east coast of the UK in the Humber area in a program called Net Zero Humber, which is around storing CO2 from emitters on the land and also providing hydrogen to industries on land. And that is supported by a CO2 storage offshore called the Northern Endurance Partnership. So we're a company that has experience actually in storing CO2 offshore in Norway. We've been doing it for 20 years with 2 areas called Sleipner and Snøhvit. And we actually are now developing the world's first open source CO2 storage, taking commercial CO2 from Norwegian industry in a project called Northern Lights. And I'll come back to that in a second. The focus for today is really around business models. But as Anthony and Jason have said, CCUS is necessary for the UK to meet its net zero targets. It needs to be part of our future. The reason it doesn't exist in the moment is because essentially it's a market failure, as the Treasury would say. There is no market for it to happen by itself. And the UK is wanting to create this market and to create it at speed and at scale. And so the way that needs to happen is a creation of business models set up by the government that support and enable industry investment so that a market is created. And Anthony's touched on offshore wind, how that really was kickstarted by government support and has now generated its own momentum. The storage of CCUS will be exactly the same. If you're talking about what specific business models are necessary, that is partially a political decision by the UK government about what balance of risk and reward it wants to take and it wants business to take. So if I come back to the Northern Lights example, here about 80% of the capital expenditure for that project was funded by the Norwegian government, but all the commercial risk of running it, getting customers, was taken by us. Without that capex spending by the government, it wouldn't have happened. But they wanted to put the risk of ongoing operations to business, which is reasonable. And I think what we have found, and I think this is a lesson for the UK, is it is a classic case of build it and they will come. So there's a lot of talk across Europe and elsewhere about how CCUS can play a role in low carbon economies, but companies and emitters will sit on the sidelines until they have something concrete they can actually do. So if I put it in context, we now have a project with the Northern Lights where the site is being drilled, the facilities are being built. We can offer customers a price for their carbon storage. And we have 10 times, that's 10 times the amount of interest from customers across Norway and elsewhere than we had anticipated from the beginning. And so it looks very, very clearly that our target of about 1.5 million tons per year of storage to start with, building to 5 million, is going to happen in that Northern Lights project. So for the UK, I think our message is, in a way, as Jason has said, is build it and they will come. It doesn't really matter too much what the precise modalities of those business models are, as long as they are clear and long term, so that we as a business know whether this is a low risk, low return type of business, or higher risk, higher return type of business. We can get behind any of that. We definitely believe that creating the facilities, government kickstarting them, getting them funded, is going to be the route to them happening, and then to building out as a commercial venture over the decades to come. One last point before I finish is, in terms of the opportunities and challenges of this, I think one of the things we also need to demonstrate outside business models is the safety of what we're doing. This is creating a new market. People don't really know what it's all about, but by showing, for example, as we have in Norway, that we have stored CO2 under the sea for 20 years. We need to give that reassurance to people out in the public that this is a technology that works, is safe, and can help the UK reduce its emissions in a significant way. Many thanks.
Great, thank you very much. I've already got some questions for you after that, but we'll come to Luke Warren next, who's, as I said, Chief Executive of the Carbon Capture and Storage Association, representing the whole sector.
Great, thank you very much, Anthony. And have my slides come up?
Yep.
Oh, excellent. Okay, great. So I'm going to try and keep my comments to 5 minutes. So I'm going to be talking about business models here. Before we go into the detail of those, I think it's worth just reflecting on what outcome we're looking to achieve. And I realise there's a lot of information on this slide, but in the context of business models, I think there are two key take-home messages here. The first of those is that if you look at the figure, you will see that the amount of CO2 that's expected, or there's a significant amount of CO2 that's expected to be captured and stored in the period of 2050, and that is going to come really from across the economy. So what we see is that there will be a need for CCS to be developed to enable the development of low carbon hydrogen to support decarbonisation of heating and parts of the transportation fleet. We will need CCS for greenhouse gas removals, so that's for bioenergy with CCS along with direct air capture, to help decarbonise our industry, and also to provide support for flexible power generation. So it's really a cross-economy solution, but I think the other key point is that it's going to be needed at a very significant scale by the middle of the century. But also, there's actually a significant amount that needs to be done this decade, and I think this is kind of key to the government's direction of travel on the business models. So by 2030, the Committee on Climate Change have suggested that we may need to be storing around 20 million tonnes of CO2 annually here in the UK. So moving on beyond the need to deliver on net zero targets, CCS is also seen as having a very significant opportunity for the UK in terms of supporting the decarbonisation of our industrial regions, but also as representing a really important future clean growth opportunity. So what you see on the figure on the right-hand side are our major industrial regions, And then represented by the open circles is where our geological stores are. So CCS has the opportunity to establish infrastructure that enables these industrial regions to decarbonise through the provision of low carbon infrastructure, which can help the industries located in these regions transition to a net zero economy. But going forward, what we also see is that this is an area where the UK potentially has a really significant competitive advantage here. We have the geological assets, we have the industrial infrastructure here, but we also have the skills and the supply chain. That means that the UK does have a clear potential here to become a significant player in a future global CCUS market. And some of the analysis that's been undertaken by Bayes suggests that this market could be very significant by the middle of this century. So we see a number of very significant drivers for CCS, and what we've seen, and we've heard this already from Jason and from David, is a significant amount of industrial activity in this area. So again, this is obviously the same figure from the previous slide, but overlaid on this is the logos from some of the key industrial partnerships that have been formed to develop CCS within these regions. So what we have in each of the regions are consortiums of industry coming together, working with devolved administrations and local governments to develop CCS propositions. And all of these clusters are looking to have in place the CCS infrastructure and be storing CO2 really from the middle of the 2020s onwards, with a goal to having significant volumes of CO2 being stored by the back end of this decade. So turning now to business models, and I'm very aware that this is perhaps not the most aesthetically attractive slide here, but I think what it does try to do is provide an oversight of how the business models are going to operate in practice. So if you think back to my first slide, what we see is that CCS is a technology that can be applied to multiple sources of emissions across the economy. So what the government has put in place with its work on business models is a regulated network approach to developing the CO2 transport and storage business. So that's represented by the yellow box on the left-hand side here. So the government is looking to essentially incentivize the development of a CO2 transport and storage company that can manage CO2 on the behalf of any of the emitters that will be capturing their CO2. And you'll see a number of those emitters listed on the middle of this diagram under users. So the expectation then is that we'll have, for example, contract for differences, which will be used to support CCS in the power sector, very similar to what's been used for renewable energy and new nuclear. We'll have industrial carbon capture projects, etc. And those contracts will incentivize emitters to capture their CO2 and then to pay a fee for the transport and storage company to manage that CO2 on their behalf. So what we've seen in terms of government activity in this space has been a significant amount of activity over the last year. In November of 2020, we saw the government come forward with its 10-point plan. What they have set out there has been an ambition to have 10 million tonnes of CO2 being stored annually by 2030, and for that to be located in four industrial clusters around the UK. I think what we've seen since the release of that report has been the advice from the Committee on Climate Change in terms of the level of activity required to deliver on the 6th carbon budget. And what they have suggested is that actually from the UK, we may need to be significantly upping our ambition in terms of the amount of CO2 we wish to store by 2030. So their analysis suggests up to 20 million tonnes by that time. Government has also come forward with further detail on the process by which it's going to be bringing forward those CCS clusters that I showed on the earlier slide. So we have a set of detail now that's come out with the latest document that was literally released on Friday, which sets out a number of processes that will bring forward the clusters in stages over the second half of the 2020s. And what's absolutely key going forward will be the spending review at the end of this year, which will need to establish the affordability envelope which can enable those CCUS clusters to be developed. And we've had good progress on the business models. So the government set out its approach to how it's going to incentivise the development of CO2 transport and storage infrastructure, how it's going to support the uptake of CCS in the power and industrial sectors. But what we do need is for the government to come forward with further detail on how it intends to support low carbon hydrogen production and then also greenhouse gas removals. And clearly it's going to be absolutely critical that momentum on these business models is maintained over the coming years if we're to have the investment decisions really taken from 2022, which will be necessary if we're to have the first of these clusters operating and storing CO2 from the mid-2020s. So hopefully that's my 5 minutes taken up, and I'll bring my comments to a close there.
Great, thank you. Thank you for that fascinating detail there. And then finally, we come to, before questions, our last speaker, Dr. Maxine Atkerst from the British Geological Survey.
Hello, everyone. My name is Maxine Atkerst. As Anthony has said, I'm a geologist at the British Geological Survey, and we are the UK's national impartial provider of geoscience information. As Anthony points out, I've been specialising in CCS since 2008 to help us reduce our national emissions. And I have been leading scientific development of the UK national storage resource, including the scientific development of the National CO2 Storage Database. And thank you very much, Luke, for showing the database with the sites on your slides. Thank you. It wasn't set up like that, but thank you anyway. In my most recent work, I have led EU and BEIS funded projects looking at the decarbonisation of clusters, applied to case studies in the UK at Grangemouth and Teesside, both the implementation of hydrogen and CCS and industrial CCS. So what are the different models that are needed for scaling up? Well, for me, my work is CO2 storage, and I know from my work that we have a substantial storage resource equal to that, as mentioned by our speaker from Equinor in Norway. And I'm not frightened by the annual rates of tens of million tons per year, as shown by Luke, because our theoretical capacity is 78,000 million tons. So the important part for me that although the business case is not my own expertise, I know that it is essential. All the research that we do, all the fabulous geological storage resource that we have in the UK won't be used to reduce emissions unless we have a business model that can be implemented by industry. So what in terms of practical steps to make it viable and effective? So my work intends to reduce the cost of CCS to you, the public, the industry, and the government by increasing our knowledge and understanding of the technology, and by increasing certainty on our resources, our capacity, its availability, and management of resources to do the CO2 storage that Luke has just been showing us. By doing that, we can then reduce the perceived risk and so the cost to an energy implementation CCS project. So what are the key opportunities and challenges in making the business case? You already told you that isn't particularly my field of expertise, but in the projects that I have recently led, researchers have looked at the UK case studies in the elegancy and hydrogen CCS, and they have considered the challenges and opportunities presented by the business cases. They have presented business case tools to identify business and investment risk and risk mitigation strategies, and also the development of possible public-private business models. In the Parallel Align project, they applied those business case assessment tools to 2 industry clusters in the UK, and they developed potential conceptual business models for Grangemouth and for the Teesside industry clusters. They make recommendations on risk allocation between the public and private sectors. and the commercial structures for phased development of a transport and storage cluster. And if that is of interest to you and wish you to read that and make it available, it is publicly available to be able to review those recommendations on the relevant project websites.
Okay, great, thank you. You also get a reward for these for sticking within the 5 minutes, I think, which is we didn't with any others. We've got some questions coming in. I just have one first for David Cairns, just from the Northern Lights thing in the project in Norway. How that works commercially, because you said you've had interest from around the world of companies that want to use the facility or pay for it. Are they doing that from a philanthropic point of view, or is it a sort of commercial decision from them? If you see what I mean, is it part of their? Is it just a cost they're absorbing, or is it financially motivated?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for those questions. And if I may, I'll take on a bit of Kirsty's question as well around exports, if that's okay. So for example, in Norway, there are carbon taxes. And so where there are carbon taxes, there is a financial incentive to look at other options. So as I said, we have been able to provide companies really in Norway, but also in continental Europe, to say, look, if you store the CO2, this is what we can offer you as a price. I can't tell you what that price is because that's commercially confidential, but it is a business thing.
Higher per ton than the cost of.
Exactly. So that's about incentivizing the market. So that's the way this is going, and that really touches in a way touches on Kirsty's question about exports. So as Maxine said, the UK has enormous potential for CO2 storage, and certainly we as an investor here see the potential for, in a way, services exports of this, by which I mean CO2 imports for storage. Some of that is also domestic. So on the Luke slide of the various industrial clusters around the UK, South Wales has no storage. So CO2 emissions from South Wales will have to be transported to be stored elsewhere. We know that in continental Europe, for example, in Germany, there's a strong aversion to having CO2 storage in Germany because it'd be on land. But there's also an enormous need from Germany's industry to store it. So we think that for the UK, that providing opportunities for continental European countries to start with and elsewhere to store CO2 in the UK at the clusters we've seen, it is a great potential. I can't answer bits on tax, Kirsty, but I hope the business model is clear.
Okay, that's very clear. So the huge, you could sort out our balance of trade deficit. I'm going to come to Sally Ann Hart as MP. Sally, do you want to ask your question or just read out?
Thank you, Anthony. It's just on the capacity of storage. So in the North Sea, we've got sort of quite large capacity. Is it unlimited? Is it infinite? Is there a limit on capacity? And also about leaking of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere and the damage, how will that be monitored and can it be monitored?
Maxine, do you want to come to that?
Okay, so you, in a way, it is sufficiently large. It's not infinite. The capacity is not infinite, but it is sufficiently large that it far exceeds what we would ever require. Even in the sort of most ambitious of scenarios, as illustrated by Luke. It is necessary to first of all appraise it and assess it. The theoretical capacity is not necessarily the practical or matched capacity. What that means is you narrow it down so that it gets more and more certain. You don't need all that vast amount, but you do need a significant proportion of it. And that requires quite a lot of appraisal. And so the national database does that sort of pre-appraisal, and it has been used by industry. But you asked, is it infinite? Can we use it all? It needs to be managed carefully, Sally Ann. So it isn't just a free-for-all. If you were to, I'm sorry about this, it's like the damp sponge. If you have a damp sponge and you trickle water into it from a jug, it will absorb. If you empty a bucket full, you will get wet feet. So it has to be injected at a certain rate. It has to be contained within the strata. So again, there are well understood constraints that you can only inject a certain amount because it increases the pressure. And that comes on to your question about sort of leakage. People like me and also engineers, their job is to ensure that it doesn't leak. And to the best of my knowledge, I'm not aware that any leakage has happened from a storage site. So this is a very important and it's essential job. And you said, how do we do monitoring? Again, that is an important part of how you are awarded a CO2 storage license. The demonstration you have to do beforehand, the onward going predictions, the matching of your, what you've stored with what you think you are storing, and also demonstration of secure storage by monitoring. That is absolutely essential. And so you can be reassured that there's very, very strict requirements to be able for you to do that. I mean, David was talking to us about Sleipner and Snøhvit, the two Norwegian sites, and I think he can vouch there that these have been operating for up to 20 years and more, and there has been no leakage. I think we can be rest assured on that a proper and professional and well-regulated regime is in place to be able to do that.
David, I saw Cairns.
Yeah.
I saw you had your hand up, and I don't know if Luke or Jason have anything they want to add.
Yeah, very happy to jump in.
Yeah, Luke first, and then David.
Great. So just to answer the question on storage capacity and how much we require. So I showed the analysis from the Committee on Climate Change about how much we need by the middle of this century. So in aggregate, the UK will need between 1 to potentially almost 2 billion tonnes of storage capacity between now and 2050 to reach our own net zero goals. As Maxine mentioned, the UK capacity is potentially up to 78 billion tonnes of capacity. So the UK has plenty of capacity to manage our own carbon budgets going forward. And that then I think talks to the point that Kirsty raised around the opportunity for imports. And I think the government does now recognise that this is actually potentially a really important opportunity for the UK. It has been explicitly recognised in the latest update on the business models that those business models will be structured to enable imports of CO2 from other countries. And in terms of the question around taxation, probably a little bit too much detail at this point in time, but they have started to talk about how imports could be incentivised. And their minded to position at the moment is that effectively the upside benefit from importing CO2 should be split between the operator of a TNS infrastructure, so that they're incentivized to find additional volumes of CO2, but also the users of the infrastructure, so that they are able to have the cost of that infrastructure subsidized by third country imports. So I think it's an area where we'll start to see a lot more activity going forward.
Okay. David, did you want to?
Yeah, just a couple of points if I may. So for those who are not specialists, a lot of the sites where CO2 is stored were either oil or gas sites underground. So the same safety that kept that oil underground for millions of years is going to be the geology that keeps the CO2 under it for millions of years. But in the same way as you can't take all of the oil or gas out at one go, you have to drill it out safely and calmly. You can't shove CO2 in it willy-nilly. You have to do it in safely and calmly. The other point I make, and it's picking up Nicholas's question. So for our Northern Endurance Partnership storage site off the east coast of England, we have a license with BP and National Grid to use that site. So that is not an old site, that is a new one, and that will be drilled in the same way. And then as the business expands, it will grow to additional sites in that same geography and geology. Thanks.
Okay, coming to other questions. So I've got Mayor Floyd Bosley here. So I'll assume he's on the call somewhere. What are the risks to climate and wider environment of scaling up CCS? This is a more general question. Who wants to take that? I'm really the question about leakage there, but
I mean, I'd be very happy to get started on that. And I think it comes back to the slide that I showed on the expected role of CCS. And actually what you see is that there are very, very few, if any, credible scenarios which show how we can reach net zero within the timescales that we need to reach net zero without CCS being deployed at scale. So it's seen as being absolutely critical to global efforts. I think it's increasingly recognised internationally as being an area where there's a tremendous desire for greater international cooperation here. So, I think our message is this is absolutely central to UK efforts to try and deliver on our net zero goals. I guess the question possibly is also being raised by, sorry, I don't want to take the role of chair here, but I kind of picked up on the comment from Gareth Morgan as well, which is around potential perverse outcomes from delivering these technologies. And I think that, this is something that, the government has been thinking through. So they know that, we know that CCS is going to be really, really important, but we're also keen to make sure that it's, used in a way that delivers the maximum climate benefit and doesn't have unintended consequences. And so just to give you a good example of work that's been done in this area, the government has proposed what it's calling a dispatchable power agreement, which will essentially reward low carbon flexible CCS plants. But that's been specifically designed so that actually the CCS is incentivized to operate after renewables have already started generating, but then before unabated fossil plant is generating. So the idea is that that's really where CCS adds maximum value to the system, but the government was very keen to ensure it didn't create incentives that would allow CCS plants to operate before renewable generation, as that was deemed to be an area where you'd prefer renewables to be delivering that. So I think government is very conscious about making sure that CCS is used in a way that makes the most sense from a climate perspective here.
Yeah, sorry, Maxine, you want to come back in?
Perhaps when the question from Gareth about unintended consequences, part of the studies that I've recently been in and the ones that I've just currently started, what's called life cycle analysis is considered very, very important. So what that means is that you can do it, but what is the net effect? And have you added up all of the possible pluses and minuses? Yes, you can do it, but does it actually have a net zero, or does it even better have a negative zero? So what you described as unintended consequences, I think is being carefully considered as part of these life cycle analysis contributions.
Yeah, we did an event on negative emissions some time ago. A lot of the questions are about this whole issue, and obviously, clearly, you take it as read that only if it's robust and actually does what it's intended to do is it worthwhile doing at all. If it leaks, if people game it, then it doesn't make any sense to it. So Nicholas Brown asked a very practical question. Should I just read it? Do you want to? I'll just read it out. Who owns these storage sites? If it's the Crown, that is fine, but otherwise there might be a problem, ? And I'm guessing, since it is a seabed, it is the Crown. Maxine, you know the answers.
Sort of. So if your potential storage site, Nicholas, if your potential storage site is a depleted oil or gas field, then it will be owned by those that hold the exploration license. And often that's an advantage because they have all the connecting infrastructure, they have all the expertise. Nobody loves and knows and loves their field more than them. They've been operating it with great detail and great care, potentially for decades. So the owner then could be the license holder in that respect. If your storage site is a porous sandstone in which the fluids between the grains is not oil and gas, but instead saline water, then it is the pore space is owned by the Crown or the Crown Estate, and then you would receive from them a lease to use that pore space. Does that answer your question?
It does brilliantly. Thank you very much. My only comment would be that Crown Estate is notorious for being quite tough at negotiating lease for finances, and it comes back to I know it sounds like it's the Crown, but I know it comes back to the state as a tax. One just has to be concerned that they don't overcharge, and that's always been an issue working in this field or in ports or the like.
So I think the Crown Estate and Crown Estate Scotland, I think that they are very much supportive of CCS. And so I think that's that's the first time I've heard that they are, they're tough negotiators and they make a hard price. I think if they want CCS to work, they have to make sure that it's a part of a viable business model and it's not too expensive for them. However,
Thank you very much.
Just want to come to some of the other questions that David Richardson asks. How do you balance the injection rate compared to the emission capture rate to ensure everything that is produced can be stored with the interim buffer storage? Does that, Maxine, do you want to?
So I'm not quite so sure when you say interim buffer storage, David.
Yeah, Maxine, I was just referring back to your thoughts and about your explanation of the sponge and the bucket of water. So I just wanted to make sure that we weren't delivering a bucket of water to the sponge when we're delivering the capture, and whether it actually needed a buffer storage somewhere along the way.
Yes, David, to the best of my knowledge, I'm not an industry person, but the best of my knowledge, and perhaps David will help with this, is that there is contractual terms on what you have to be able to provide as a provider, and what you are to receive as a storer. That is the way it used to be before this new contracts for difference and the regulated asset base came into play. So I don't think there would need to be interim storage, but it would be the terms of the regulated asset base. You would pay the transport and storage company, you would pay the fee for storage, and they would ensure that it is stored. And don't worry, you wouldn't get wet. There's the equivalent of wet feet. I don't think that is definitely not, this is definitely not part of the business model.
Thanks, Maxine.
Jason, you want to come in there?
Yeah, I can only speak for our own experience in our own cluster, and I'm sure David could add some more to this as well, but it's really important that the emitters and the TNS operator work closely together. And one way to kind of minimise that short-term impact is to develop multiple wells and storage sites together. So if you use Maxine's analogy, if you had one sponge, one injection point, and there was a problem with that, it affects everybody downstream. If you have multiple storage sites, multiple geological sites with multiple wells, and you can move CO2 between these storage sites, then I think we are being asked as an emitter, quite rightly, for very clear CO2 profiles over the next 10, 15, 20 years. And I know that our colleagues in the Northern Endurance Partnership are sort of working to receive those and build those into how they develop and manage storage infrastructures going forward. So as Maxine says, there is no intermediate buffer storage. It's very much the emitters and the TNS operators working closely together to make sure the numbers match, and that there are options if one storage facility has to slow down or stop for a period of time for any reason.
A question of all of you, really. David mentioned that in Norway there's a carbon tax which basically makes, or indeed in other countries, it makes the price of carbon dioxide greater than the cost of burying it. And that creates incentive for people to use CCS. Is there a preference between using a carbon tax like that or an emissions trading scheme that creates its own, capped emissions trading scheme that makes its own price of carbon? I assume that there's no real difference there, although a carbon tax would create greater long-term certainty for you.
I mean, I'd be happy just to give you an initial volume perspective on that. So certainly from an industry perspective, actually generally prefer an emissions trading scheme over a tax. And that's partly because an emissions trading scheme is seen, rightly or wrongly, as being potentially less vulnerable to political interventions.
Right.
If you like, whereas the problem with a carbon tax is potentially at every budget, the Chancellor has the right to reassess that carbon tax level, and then that makes it very hard to make investment decisions off the back of that. So generally an ETS is the preferred way forward. And certainly from our perspective.
Less fiscal risk.
Exactly.
All right, we're politicians, we can take it. Sally Ann, you had at heart, but you had another question about carbon storage tanks, I think.
Sorry, another question. So I think it was actually answered. So it seems clear from the chat that we need to have these carbon storage tanks because they will store carbon much more quickly than nature-based solutions. And so, but actually moving forward, we do need nature-based solutions working in tandem, I presume, with the storage. So there's a place for both.
I think, yeah, Maxine?
I think I'm interesting that these are referred to as tanks. They're porous, so they're rocks with lots of little holes in them. I agree that we need to do everything. We have not now the luxury of sitting on our hands and saying which one is best, which one should we do first. If we're going to achieve the very ambitious targets to reduce the impact on climatic change, we're going to have to do everything. I think my concern is that there still seems to be some sort of competition, as if you can do things naturally, so to speak, without by sort of growing more trees. But growing more trees takes a long time, and our industrial clusters produce, you know, tens of millions of tons of CO2 per year, and we can store at that rate, and we can store it's permanent storage, and once it's enacted, it will do as has been happening in Norway. It will work year in, year out, with care, and also careful regulation and safe technology.
Yeah. So Dr. Richard Lees, who's here, got quite a long question. Are you on the line, Richard?
Yeah, thank you.
You can say where you're from as well as an organisation.
Yeah, sure. Richard Lees from the Mineral Products Association, represent the cement and lime producers in the UK. The BEIS business models currently focus on the 6 industrial clusters, and yet the government industrial decarbonisation strategy identifies that around half of the industrial emissions are outside of those clusters. And my question is, how quickly do we think we can move to a business model that's universal and caters for those dispersed sites, those sites not in clusters, and also a business model that includes CO2 utilisation as well as storage?
Is that one for Luke or?
Yeah, happy to have a first go at that. I guess, Richard, what I would do actually is point you to the update on the transport and storage business model that came out on Friday. And I think you'll be very pleased to see in there that the government is now very open to also supporting the development of transport options which might use shipping, potentially rail, potentially road, etc., which is, you know, really going to be important if we're able to take the CO2 from some of those dispersed sites and add that to the clusters. So I think that's been a really important development. On utilisation, so utilisation in theory is very much open to being supported under the business models, but it has to demonstrate that it's delivering a clear climate benefit. And I think one of the challenges that we've had so far with some of the utilisation options that have been put forward is that while they, you know, can often deliver, you know, a variety of environmental benefits, their climate benefits are not always very clear, because sometimes the CO2 is used and then released back to the atmosphere. But where there are good utilisation options, and the cement industry has a number of excellent opportunities around carbonation, and I think the government is very much minded to look to try and support those.
Okay, so Bob, sorry, Maxine.
So I understand where you're coming from, Richard. I'm involved in sort of several broad CO2 storage projects across the EU, and they're always looking for ways to store the energy and to reuse the CO2 so that it can be then captured as formic acid, or it can be stored as ammonia, and some of these things can be used as a feedstock for chemicals. However, you also have to think of getting back to the familiar story of the life cycle. So the life cycle appraisal is that you have to be sure that that there is actually a net long-term capture and isolation of the CO2 from the atmosphere, which is always a concern. However, unfortunately, these sorts of technologies are very, very low technology readiness levels. And so I think in the interim, transport from an isolated site to a storage to a more conventional, if you will, type of storage is more likely to be practicable in the first instance for isolated sites.
Okay, we've got just 5 more minutes, and Bob Harris pre-submitted a question which isn't about the business model but about an alternative technology. I don't know if you want to ask the question, Bob, and say where you're from. You need to unmute yourself. You haven't unmuted yourself. I'll ask, Bob seems to be struggling with the mute button. I'll ask the question. The question is submitted was, how important does the panel consider the use of enhanced natural weathering in carbon capture and storage? Oh no, it's taken his mute button off now. Bob.
Yeah, okay. So in 1873, an English farmer called Samson Morgan developed a technique of mineralizing his soils with granite dust. His book went to 3 editions, and there was a lot of work done on it. That was essentially lost. But I've been working with the British Library, and the issue now is that you can not only mineralize your soils and fertilize your soils and plants with granite dust, which can be a waste product, but you can also carry out carbon capture with it. Now, I know of nobody anywhere in the world that's actually working on this now. I've got 22,000 people following me on this, and I'm looking for a larger company to put that model into operation.
Okay, I'm not sure whether any of our panelists have any views on that. That's quite a left field question. Jason.
I'll have a go. I'm not an expert on enhanced soil weathering, but as a company that believes in negative emissions, we've looked at lots of tech. And I think Maxine made an important point earlier. We need all of these things. If you have the land and you have the byproduct available, then it seems like a relatively low cost, sensible, additive thing to do. I think in overall capture terms and sort of thinking around permanence, the contribution might not be at the scale that you can do from an engineered solution, but it all contributes to the, to the sort of position we're trying to reach as a net zero 2050. So there is a role for all of these technologies, and I think, if that infrastructure, the land, the space, the byproduct is available, why not? We should do it.
Absolutely. Who should I go to?
Somebody with lots of land and access to byproduct granite dust. It's a difficult one to pull together, which probably explains why it hasn't happened yet.
Yeah. I'm not sure in a position to answer that here now. We've got just a few minutes left, and Lord Carrington, I think last question goes to you.
May I ask, please, is there general agreement on the way that all these activities that you've been describing are measured, or is there disagreement on the measurements?
Which is absolutely critical. How do you measure a ton of carbon dioxide that somebody's trying to offset to pay you for it?
I'd be happy to just start on that. So there's actually been quite a lot of work done on this, well, about 10 years ago, actually. So basically, to have a geological store licensed by the Oil and Gas Authority, it has to meet the requirements around monitoring, so that the CO2 that's stored there is demonstrated not to be emitted to atmosphere, and then that links back to the emissions trading scheme and the regulations there, so then you don't have to surrender an allowance. So there's been a lot of work done to ensure the environmental integrity of these projects.
Maxine?
And so to follow on from Luke, thank you for starting. So once the CO2 is injected into the ground in your CO2 storage site, there are sort of what they call geophysical tools. So for those that are familiar with oil and gas exploration, it's sort of seismic surveys, seismic profiles, and it is researchers that myself and my colleagues particularly, look at ways to how we can refine that and make that as accurate as possible. So even though you can't go down underground and see it, that you can demonstrate that it has been securely stored and most importantly contained within the site. So that's very much a field of expertise and a field of research to make it as accurate and most important for the business case, as cheap as possible. Nothing is cheap in terms of this sort of remotely sensed information, but we are attempting to make it remotely accessed, remotely sensed, remote download of data, continual time monitoring. And this is the type of research that my colleagues undertake so that we can know how much is stored and demonstrate that it is where we think it is and that it stays there.
Excellent. Thank you very much for that, Maxine. And I think the environmental integrity of CCS is absolutely fundamental. I mean, there's no point in doing any of it if it isn't actually doing what we think it's doing to reach net zero. It's 5 o'clock. We've reached our time, I'm afraid. Thank you, everyone, for coming. Thank you, Maxine, Luke, Jason, and David. And till the next time of the APPG, thank you all and have a good evening.
Many thanks.
Thank you.